to the king!
Imagine this. A 15-year-old boy lies shivering inside the damp stone walls of Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, while an entire kingdom holds its breath with every broken gasp of his lungs, as the sweating sickness tightens its grip around the boy who was never meant to die, Arthur, Prince of Wales, the living prophecy, the golden hope of a fragile dynasty, built not on centuries of lineage, but on the momentum of a single decisive battlefield. A boy named for the legendary king, and raised not merely to rule, but to resurrect a new Camelot, to bring order and peace to a land still trembling from the Wars of the Roses, and beside him, a girl, 16 years old, a Spanish princess, and the daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom, Catherine of Aragon, whose marriage to Arthur was meant to unite not just two young souls, but two great empires, forging a future for England, upon which the entire Tudor vision depended. And if that night had gone the way the history books recorded, then Arthur would have died. The world would have tilted, and Henry, the arrogant younger brother, being trained for the church, would have been dragged from Latin prayers to the throne of England, setting off a chain reaction that would explode across Europe and the world, birthing 6 wives, one bloody Reformation, the burning of abbeys, the founding of America, and the rise of Elizabeth. But what if the fever had broken? What if Arthur had lived? What if history slipped just one breath to the side? What world would we have awoken in? Because if Arthur survived that night, in the year 1502, he would eventually take the throne at the age of 22, after the death of his father, Henry VII, in the year 1509, not Henry VIII, not the bloated king with a festering leg and a taste for decapitation, but a measured, scholarly, devout ruler who adored his wife and loathed extravagance, a king who never needed to annul his marriage because Catherine, his beloved, his partner, since their teenage years, would give him a son, a strong, healthy boy, born in 1505, named Henry, solidifying the Tudor succession without scandal, without blood, without a single whisper of treason. And so Arthur II would be crowned not with desperate fanfare, but with calm stability. And the younger brother, blocked from the throne, would walk the path originally planned for him, diving into theology and rising to become a cardinal, a force of nature cloaked in crimson, a man who could debate theology at dawn and shatter lances by dusk. And if that sounds strange, unsettling, and then think further in this world, there is no Anne Boleyn seducing a king, no Elizabeth born in scandal, no virgin queen rallying a nation against the Armada, no Protestant identity forged in fire and fear, no King James Bible shaping the cadence of the English tongue, no golden age of spies, pirates, and poets, only a quiet, devout England, locked in loyalty to Rome, bound to Spain, not by grudging treaties, but by blood and affection. A kingdom that never split, never rebelled, never reformed. An England that chose stillness over upheaval, obedience over independence, peace over fire, because when Arthur lived, everything else remained asleep. The dissolution never happened. The abbeys still stood. The gentry never bought cheap monastic lands and never rose to power. Parliament never grew teeth. The colonies were never planted. And the foundations of the modern English-speaking world were never laid. And so when you speak English today, when you walk through a parliamentary democracy, When you celebrate individual rights, freedom of conscience, or literary brilliance born of rebellion, you must remember it all began with a death in a damp Welsh castle over 500 years ago. And in a world where Arthur did not die, your world, your country, your culture might never have been born. The year was 1502, and Ludlow Castle stood soaked in a dampness that clung to the walls like grief. The wind pressed against its stone windows as though trying to whisper a warning, or perhaps a prayer. In one of its high chambers, draped in thick woolen tapestries and filled with the scent of herbs, a prince lay dying, or so the world believed. Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, was wrapped in blankets too heavy for a body so thin. He was burning. His skin, once soft and pale, now flushed a sickly red. His breaths were shallow, his voice barely more than a rasp when he called for Catherine, his young wife of only a few months, whose own body trembled with the same fever, yet who refused to leave his side. Those who served them, nurses, priests, herbalists, moved like shadows, speaking in hushed tones, preparing for death. The priests had begun to mutter last rites under their breath. Outside, horses stood saddled for the inevitable ride southward to London, carrying the news that would shatter a king's heart and reorder the map of Europe. It had happened before, heirs dying in castles, but never one like this. Never one whose name had been chosen not from tradition but prophecy. Never one raised from cradle to rule, to steady the fragile foundations of a house still new to power. If Arthur died, the Tudor project might die with him. Everyone felt it. Everyone feared it. But Catherine did not believe it. In her shivering state, she still clutched his hand. She whispered to him in Spanish, words of comfort, prayers of saints, memories of warm nights in the Alcazar when she was a child and the world still made sense. She fed him spoonfuls of water laced with bitter herbs. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead. She spoke to him as though he were already recovering, because she needed it to be true. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was youth. Perhaps it was God. But somehow, in that long, dreadful night, when the fever was meant to take him, as it had taken so many others, something changed. The fever broke, slowly, subtly, like a fog lifting over a lake. Arthur's breaths began to deepen. The trembling in his fingers eased. His eyes, red-rimmed and glassy, began to blink with recognition. The priest, called in to deliver last rites, found himself dismissed by a physician who dared to believe. By morning, the messengers still waited in the courtyard, but not to deliver news of death. Instead, a different kind of news was prepared. The prince had survived. The heir still lived. In London, when the word reached Henry VII, no trumpets were sounded. He was not a man of extravagance, but those closest to him would later whisper that the king wept not for show, not for politics, but in private, knees bent before the altar, hands clasped tight. He had built his reign on strategy, on control, on silence. But this was grace. Arthur was back on the path. The future, so close to slipping away, had returned. Weeks passed. Arthur grew stronger. Catherine recovered. The castle no longer smelled of death but of broth and beeswax, and the crushed lavender laid beneath pillows. The two teenagers, married not just in ceremony but in shared pain, emerged from their illness changed out. Not broken, hardened, older. Though the years had not yet passed, they walked together in the castle gardens, fingers entwined, speaking less like children forced into union and more like survivors who had chosen to hold on. In London, Prince Henry, still only 10 years old, was told by his tutors that he could return to his Latin. His future no longer pointed toward the throne. He was, once more, the spare, and though he was young, he understood enough to recognize that the crown was no longer his burden or his opportunity. He bowed to the news. Outwardly, he showed the same brilliance, the same hunger for knowledge, the same grace of a child raised among courts and expectations. But inside, something shifted. He had tasted, however, briefly, a shadow of what might have been. And that shadow would linger. Years went by. Arthur and Catherine were left largely to themselves in Ludlow. As the king saw fit to keep his heir away from the dangerous politics of court, it was a decision made for stability. But it granted them something few royal couples ever had: time. Real time. Years in which love was not just a duty but a possibility. Their bond deepened. Catherine taught Arthur Spanish. Arthur read poetry to her in Latin. They debated scripture, discussed politics, laughed over simple meals. They rode through the countryside, visited monasteries, sponsored chapels, and prayed together at dawn. They became slowly, tenderly more than the symbols they had been trained to be. They became human. And in the year 1505, when Catherine gave birth to a healthy boy, the kingdom exhaled in unison. He was named Henry, not for his uncle, but for his grandfather, a king who had clawed his way to the throne through blood and battle, and who now saw in this newborn child the stability he had fought his whole life to achieve. The line was secure, an heir, and now a spare. The Tudor name, once so precarious, was etched into the future. When Henry VII passed away in the spring of 1509, it was not chaos that followed. There were no power struggles, no desperate claims, no uncertain regencias. The 22-year-old Arthur ascended with quiet dignity. His coronation was not gilded in gold, but in meaning. A prince who had almost died now lived to wear the crown. A marriage once feared political became a symbol of love. A kingdom, once built on the ashes of civil war, now found itself in the hands of a thoughtful, steady king and a queen who knew what it meant to endure. And thus began a reign that would never be written in the history books, but in another world. It might have been the most peaceful England ever knew. When Arthur became king, in the year 1509, the kingdom braced itself not for spectacle, but for serenity. His coronation, held beneath the vaulted arches of Westminster Abbey, echoed not with roaring conquest or wild cheers, but with the low, solemn chants of monks, the soft swish of embroidered robes, and the quiet, measured footsteps of a king who had almost not lived to see this moment. There were no golden fountains, no fireworks in the sky, no games held for foreign eyes. Instead, there was stillness, reverence, and the overwhelming sense that England had just entered something rare in its history, a time of deliberate peace. Arthur II was not his father, who had grasped the throne with a sword in one hand and suspicion in the other. And he was not his brother, who in another timeline would have devoured palaces and women with the same ravenous appetite he brought to war. Arthur was calm. Arthur was careful. Arthur listened more than he spoke, and perhaps most importantly, Arthur was not afraid to seem small in the face of God. He had spent much of his youth studying not only the art of governance, but the works of Aquinas, of Boethius, of the great moral philosophers who warned of pride, who taught that a king who ruled without understanding was merely a tyrant in gilded cloth. He had nearly died once, and because he ruled with the quiet clarity of a man who knew that life was not promised, and that the weight of a crown should feel heavy. At his side was Catherine, now queen, not by title alone, but by temperament. She was not a shadow of her husband, nor merely the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. She was a woman of letters, fluent in Latin and Greek, pious without fanaticism, and fiercely intelligent in courtly debate. Theirs was a marriage not shaped by distance, but by closeness. They rose together before dawn to pray in the royal chapel. They took meals without courtiers, read manuscripts in the garden, and consulted one another on matters of foreign policy. Ambassadors returning to Spain often wrote home that Queen Catherine's words carried as much weight as the king's, and the king did not mind. He welcomed her voice. He relied on it. Arthur's court was not a carnival of color and rivalry, but a quiet engine of refinement. From Italy came artists with soft brushstrokes and a love for symmetry. From the Low Countries came instruments and scholars who brought with them the works of Erasmus and the beginnings of a humanism that questioned without destroying. The court became a sanctuary of letters, a place where music floated from windowed halls and debates echoed through cloistered corridors. Poetry was encouraged. Philosophy was taught. Education was not the privilege of princes alone, but extended outward to the children of noblemen and merchants alike. In those early years, it seemed as if Arthur wished to build not just a kingdom, but a mind. England, under his early reign, it knew something. It had long forgotten steadiness. There were no riots in the streets, no factions battling for influence, no sudden shifts in church policy or drastic tax reforms. Arthur kept to his father's careful economic model: tight coinage, restrained expenditure, balanced books. He made no enemy of Parliament, nor did he grant it unnecessary power. He expanded the navy slowly, not to conquer, but to protect trade routes that were finally beginning to flourish. He avoided open war with France not out of cowardice, but because he saw no reason to spill the blood of farmers and sons over cloth and pride. And when the French king sent taunting letters, Arthur sent gifts of illuminated psalters, diplomatic flattery, and the occasional warning cloaked in Latin riddles. It was not a reign of glory, but of growth, not one of conquests, but of cultivation. And yet, not everyone rejoiced in the quiet. In the great halls of York, another man was rising tall, broad-shouldered, and ablaze with energy that had no battlefield. Prince Henry, now Duke of York and Cardinal of England, was like a furnace contained within a cathedral. He wore the robes of a churchman, but beneath them beat the heart of a lion. He studied with monks in the morning and shattered opponents in the tilt-yard by noon. His sermons were filled with fire. His debates scorched, papal in voice. And though he knelt in prayer each night, those close to him knew that the flames of ambition had not gone out, only been redirected. To many, he was a marvel. To others, a threat. He remained loyal to Arthur. Yes, but loyalty was a choice he made daily, not a duty he accepted blindly. He never once questioned his brother's rule publicly, but in private, he kept volumes of letters, detailed notes, court gossip. He read reports from Rome, whispered with Spanish envoys, spoke often of the dangers of heresy spreading from Germany. If Arthur was the steady hand guiding the ship, Henry was the storm just over the horizon, waiting, always waiting, for something to stir. Still, for now, there was calm. The child born in 1505 grew healthy and tall. a boy already echoing the balance of his father and the fire of his uncle. They named him Henry, and in him lay the security of the dynasty. The queen, ever watchful, bore a second child, 2 years later, a daughter named Mary, who showed her mother's eyes and her father's solemnity. And so the Tudor line, once so perilously thin, now had not only an heir, but a future rich with possibilities. But beyond England's shores, winds began to shift. In the year 1517, in a small German town called Wittenberg, a monk nailed a list of 95 complaints to a church door. His name was Martin Luther. His words were printed, smuggled, and whispered across Europe like wildfire, hidden beneath wet leaves. The Reformation had begun, and though it had not yet reached English shores, Arthur knew it would. The scholars at his court debated the theses by candlelight. The priests in his chapels questioned indulgences, and the cardinal in York, his own brother, wrote furious rebuttals by hand, his ink dark with fury. But that would come later. For now, England was still whole, still quiet, still waiting. And in the hush of those early years, under the rule of a king who read more than he hunted, who loved once and deeply, who believed in duty more than legacy, the kingdom held its breath, not in fear, but in the strange, unfamiliar comfort of knowing, for the first time in memory, that nothing needed to change. He had once been the boy no one noticed, the second son with red cheeks and wild legs, the child left behind while his older brother learned the weight of a crown. Henry, Duke of York, had not grown up expecting power. That was Arthur's burden, Arthur's path. And when Arthur survived the fever and returned to life with a breathless kingdom rejoicing at his recovery, Henry was quietly returned to his books, to his Latin grammar and the shadowed halls of monastic education, to the whispers of Scripture and the rituals of the church. Yet from the very beginning, it was clear that Henry was not meant for silence. He was tall early, broad-shouldered, loud in chapel, and louder on horseback. His tutors complained that he recited prayers too quickly, as if racing against time, as if the ritual were a tournament, and he meant to win. But they could not deny his mind. His memory was sharp, precise. He absorbed Augustine, devoured Aquinas, sparred with his instructors not with rebellion but with a fierce, almost desperity intensity. He did not want to pass. He wanted to dominate, and when he rode at the lists, armor gleaming like a second skin, his lance struck with the force of a man who had something to prove. It was as if all the energy that had once been shaped toward ruling a kingdom had now been distilled into something else, an intellectual fire, a theological hunger, and an ambition that had not died but been diverted. By the time he reached his third decade of life, he was no longer simply Prince Henry. He was Cardinal Henry, Archbishop of York, and the most powerful churchman in all of England. His robes were scarlet. His name carried weight in Rome. His reputation, stretching from Canterbury to Calais, was a strange alchemy of awe and dread. He was not gentle. He was not patient. But he was brilliant, and he was Tudor. His sermons could rattle rafters. His correspondence with the Pope was filled with Latin so polished it shimmered. He convened councils, rooted out corruption, and debated bishops in private chambers, and then rode out into the countryside, boots muddied from visiting poor parishes and monasteries, never forgetting that real power must be seen to be understood. And yet, he was never king. That fact followed him like a second shadow, not bitterly, not openly, but with the slow, constant ache of something that might have been. He did not resent Arthur. Or if he did, he buried it deep. In public, they were two halves of a whole, the crown and the cross, the ruler and the soul. In private, they spoke as brothers. Though Arthur's words were measured and Henry's burned, there were no open arguments. Only long silences in the middle of theological disagreements. Only the occasional flicker in Henry's eyes when court decisions fell beyond his reach. But there was loyalty, and Arthur trusted him. Not blindly, but fully. It was Henry who stood beside the king when ambassadors from Rome arrived to discuss the early mutterings of the German monk. It was Henry who advised caution when scholars began importing copies of Luther's writings into Cambridge, hiding them between pages of astronomy texts. It was Henry who read every line, every syllable, and declared them heresy. And it was Henry who, before any fire was lit or decree issued, wrote his own treatise. In response, a thunderous condemnation of Protestant thought that echoed through every cathedral in England, and earned from the Pope not only a blessing, but a title, Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. He might not have worn a crown, but in matters of religion, he wore something heavier, and yet he remained restless. There were rumors, always rumors, whispers that he still dreamed of rule, that his cassock concealed a crown-shaped scar, that he tested the loyalty of noblemen over wine and confession, but none of it ever amounted to more than courtly gossip. He never acted against Arthur, never raised a finger in rebellion. Instead, he reformed monasteries. He cracked down on corrupt priests. He encouraged education, funding schools for poor boys who would otherwise never read a word of Latin. He defended the poor, wrote letters to mayors, challenged dukes to treat their tenants better. And all the while, he kept an eye on the continent, on the fires beginning to glow hotter in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. He knew what was coming, even before Arthur did. The Reformation would not stay contained to Saxon forests and German villages. It would bleed into France, cross the sea into England. It would infect minds like a fever in a sleeping prince, and it would threaten everything faith, crown, order. For Henry, it was not just heresy. It was collapse. He had lived his life within the framework of the Church. His rise had been its grace, his power, its structure. To him, Luther was not just a rebel. He was a destroyer. But Arthur was calm, cautious, diplomatic. He believed in peace, in measured response. He did not burn books, nor men. He summoned scholars. He opened debate, and Henry watched his brother's gentleness with the quiet agony of a man standing on a shore as a storm begins to rise behind him. He loved Arthur, but he feared Arthur's mercy. And for the first time, their visions of England began to diverge, not in affection, but in purpose. Still, there was no rupture. Instead, there was the slow, inevitable tension of two forces moving in different directions, one toward dialogue, the other toward defense. Arthur's England remained stable, but beneath its stone walls, Henry paced, and somewhere in the recesses of his mind, beneath the sermons and the scrolls, the prayers and the policies, there burned one thought, a quiet, pulsing truth he could never admit, even to himself, that had fate shifted only slightly, had fever claimed a different name, and had the crown touched a different brow, it would have been him, and the world, perhaps, would have been fire. The year was 1517, and in a small town in Saxony, A monk with a hammer struck not just a door, but the rhythm of a new age. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed with stubborn certainty to the wooden frame of the Wittenberg church, echoed not as an act of rebellion, but as a challenge, a spark tossed into the dry underbrush of a restless continent. At first, England barely noticed. The monks kept chanting. The bishops kept blessing. The churches still smelled of incense and beeswax. The Latin Mass had not yet faltered. But Henry Cardinal of York noticed, and then, so did the king. Arthur was not a man to panic. He had seen death up close. He had learned the value of patience in gardens and prayer books. In long evenings, spent reading with Catherine beneath candlelight. In the soft rhythm of governance, carried out with humility rather than fear, he read Luther's writings carefully. Not with the wrath of a tyrant or the pride of a rival, but with the slow concern of a father overhearing a dangerous story told to his children. He saw in the German monk's words, not simply religious defiance, but the potential unraveling of centuries of kingship, of order, of Christendom itself. And so he summoned his council, not with swords drawn or flames prepared, but with parchment in hand. There was no decree of excommunication. Not yet. Instead, there were discussions. Letters were written to Rome, to Paris, to Toledo. Scholars arrived from the Netherlands, from Bologna, from the universities of France. The court at Westminster, once filled with music and debate, began to fill with heavier things, questions of doctrine, disputes over the sale of indulgences, the whispering dread that if the wrong ideas were allowed to take root, they would tear through the kingdom like ivy splitting stone. It was Henry, ever the flame to Arthur's stone, who spoke with thunder. He declared the Theses blasphemy, called Luther a heretic, a destroyer of souls, a corrupter of the flock. He wrote treatises that shook the walls of the Vatican with their clarity and venom, earning from the Pope personal thanks and the formal title, Defender of the Faith, a title that in another life would have belonged to Henry as king, not cardinal. And yet in this world, that meant more to him, because he had won it with ink, not inheritance. He traveled from abbey to abbey, inspecting manuscripts, interviewing monks, reminding England's clergy that the church was not merely ritual, but the very spine of civilization. Arthur let him rage, but he did not follow every footstep. He believed that heresy could be extinguished without martyrdom, that the fire could be smothered without kindling it with flesh. And so for years, the kingdom stood in an uneasy stillness, devout, watchful, determined to remain whole. It was a balancing act as delicate as lacework, held together not by force, but by trust. Trust in the monarch, trust in the church, trust that England, surrounded by flames, would not ignite. The people, for the most part, followed. They had no reason to rebel. Their king was not a tyrant, nor a libertine. Their queen was not foreign in spirit, but beloved in practice. Her Spanish heritage, softened by years of English speech and English charity. Their clergy, guided by the ever-vigilant Cardinal Henry, were educated and cautious. The cathedrals remained open. The Mass continued. The prayers were still said in Latin, but understood by heart. But beneath that calm surface, a quieter struggle played out, not in cathedrals, but in universities, not in Parliament, but in printing presses. For the books still came, smuggled in through Flanders, hidden in shipments of wool and spices. The pamphlets made their way into Oxford and Cambridge. into the hands of students who had never known war, who had grown up in the peace of Arthur's reign, who saw in Luther's words not danger, but possibility. They did not seek to burn down the church, but to ask questions. And that, Arthur feared, was how it always began. And yet he would not burn them. Not yet. There were interrogations, suspensions, warnings issued to schools and printing houses. But the burnings, the executions that in another timeline would become the bloody signature of Mary I, did not begin here. They were not needed. Arthur believed that if England could be shown the strength of its Catholicism, the fullness of its beauty, the logic of its doctrine, then the people would remain faithful not out of fear, but conviction. He ordered the translation of approved texts into English, not the Bible itself, but homilies, psalters, and catechisms. He funded public debates. He commissioned sermons not just for the cathedral but for the village square. He sent bishops into the countryside, not to scold, but to teach. It was, in many ways, a revolution of another kind. And beside him, Queen Catherine worked quietly. She visited convents. She supported the education of girls. She established hospitals run by nuns. She reminded the kingdom, by example, that piety could be compassionate, and that orthodoxy did not require cruelty. The people adored her. When she appeared in procession, dressed in modest velvet with a crucifix at her breast, peasants crossed themselves and whispered blessings beneath their breath. She was not a foreign queen. She was the mother of the kingdom. Together, Arthur and Catherine forged a new Catholic England, not one of blind obedience, but of cultivated devotion, a kingdom where Rome was not feared but embraced, where the church was not simply law but love, where dissent, while unwelcome, was not hunted like a wolf in the night, but watched as one watches a storm gather at the edge of the sea. Still, Henry urged more. He argued in private for stronger measures. He brought to court testimonies of heretics caught preaching in barns, smuggling Bibles wrapped in cloth, quoting Luther in alehouses. He feared delay would cost them everything. But Arthur, ever cautious, waited for the storm to strike first, waited to be certain. But the storm was coming, and whether Arthur's gentle strength would be enough to weather it, no one yet knew. There was a time, in another world, when a single name could shatter kingdoms, where the tilt of a woman's head or the curve of her smile could spark wars, rewrite religion, and birth a monarch who would stand alone against empires. But in this world, the world where Prince Arthur lived and ruled beside his Spanish queen Anne Boleyn, was only a girl among men, another lady-in-waiting with clever eyes and a French sense of fashion, whose sharp wit occasionally raised eyebrows and whose presence, fleeting and finely dressed, left behind nothing more than a perfume in passing. She still came to court. Of course, because the daughters of minor nobles always did. She was presented with the usual pageantry, curtsied in silk before the queen, stood quiet at the back of mass, laughed with the other girls behind fans carved from ivory and rosewood. Her education had still been rich, French manners, courtly dancing, the occasional Latin phrase meant to impress, but there was no king here for her to dazzle, no widower with wandering eyes, no royal obsession burning through marriage vows in pursuit of a son. King Arthur was no such man. He did not search for novelty in other women's faces. He had already loved and almost lost the one chosen for him. His fidelity was not only a matter of honor, it was a scar that ran so deep it held his marriage in place like bone. Catherine had been beside him when death came. She had wept over his fevered body and prayed over his still hands. That kind of bond does not fray because a young woman bats her lashes at court. And so Anne Boleyn, brilliant and brittle, waited and waited, and when nothing came, no gaze held too long, no touch repeated, no secret summons, she was quietly married off. A gentleman with good land and little controversy. A match made for stability. She left court before her 20th birthday. Some remembered her for a time. That bright girl with the French laugh and dark eyes. That lady who spoke her mind, just a bit too freely. But her name never carried the weight it would have carried in another world. It was never whispered in church pews, never screamed across Europe, never etched into the broken hearts of queens or the execution warrants of wives. And because there was no Anne Boleyn rising above the rest, there was no Elizabeth. No pale girl with flaming hair and steel in her voice. No virgin queen cloaked in pearls and promises. No lioness draped in velvet. Standing in defiance, as her enemies circled like wolves, she was never born. Because the circumstances of her conception born of a king's lust, a marriage denied by Rome, a church sundered from its roots, never happened. The golden age that would have shimmered in her name, the plays, the piracy, the Protestant fire was never lit. There was no England standing alone against a Catholic tide. Because England had never left the tide to begin with. It had remained quietly, stubbornly, deliberately a daughter of Rome. And what a difference that made. In this England, there was no need for spies like Francis Walsingham. No web of assassins and coded letters meant to preserve a Protestant crown. There were no hidden Catholics in priest holes. No secret masses whispered behind locked doors. There was no armada launched against an excommunicated queen. Spain, after all, was not the enemy, but the family. The alliance between England and the Habsburgs had only grown stronger through the steady years of Arthur's reign. Their ships sailed side by side. Their trade flowed like twin rivers. Their daughters married across borders. And the sea, so often a place of war, became instead a shared inheritance. In the absence of religious upheaval, English identity softened. There was no image of a tiny, Protestant island, holding out against the might of Rome. No myth forged in the crucible of isolation. There was no need. The church still stood. The Latin Mass still echoed. The abbeys still thrived. The bishops, led by Cardinal Henry, stood firm against heresy with the full blessing of king and queen alike. And the people, never pushed to choose between faith and crown, followed. This England was not without brilliance, but it was a different kind of brilliance. It was not born of defiance, but of devotion. Art bloomed, not in resistance, but in reverence. Literature flourished, not in rebellion, but in continuity. And though William Shakespeare would still be born in the year 1564, the England he walked into was not the same one that gave rise to Henry's children. There were no plays about usurping kings or mad monarchs haunted by guilt. There were no histories crafted to flatter Tudor triumphs. The politics that once shaped the theater were absent. Instead, Shakespeare would grow in an England quieter, more medieval, less fractured. His stories would draw from older wells. His tragedies would be more classical. His audience would be Catholic. His sponsors loyal not to survival, but to continuity. Even his language, deprived of the fierce thunder of the King James Bible, never commissioned, never translated, might have lacked its strange, holy music. The ripple of one life spared a single boy who did not die in a damp room in Ludlow Castle, had erased an entire lineage of women, not by violence, not by command, but by gentle redirection. In this England, queens were not born from scandal. They were born from stability, and stability has no need for thunder. Anne Boleyn lived, but she did not rise. Elizabeth never lived, and so she never had to fall. The age of Gloriana, the queen who would burn her enemies, conquer her heart, and leave no heir. But legend was nothing more than a ghost story, never told. The year was 1564, and in a timbered house in Stratford-upon-Avon, a boy was born who would one day shape the soul of a language. His name was William Shakespeare. The sky that day might have been pale with spring cloud, or bright with sun slanting across the Avon's slow curve, but in the England of Arthur's long shadow, the weather mattered little. The winds of revolution had long been stilled. There were no bonfires of scripture in village greens, no gallows for secret priests, no hidden printing presses, churning out forbidden gospels. The kingdom into which Shakespeare was born was stable, pious, prosperous, and above all, quiet. The Tudors still ruled, but it was not Elizabeth's face that peered from coins or tapestries. There was no Gloriana, no lion-hearted maiden in shining gowns who would become the muse of a nation. Instead, the court was ruled by Arthur's descendants, kings and queens born of peace, not peril, whose names inspired reverence, not mythology. They lived in palaces rich with candles and carved wood, places where Latin still echoed in chapels and the smell of frankincense hung like memory in the air. The crown did not fear Rome. Rome, in many ways, had become the mirror in which the English monarchy studied itself. Shakespeare, the man, still grew as he had in any world observant. Curious, restless, he wandered fields and marketplaces, listening. He watched actors perform morality plays. He learned his letters in Latin, as boys did, and read Ovid and Seneca with the same greedy fascination he once gave to folk tales whispered near hearth fires. But when he came of age, the theater that awaited him was not the same stage that had risen from the ashes of a fractured faith. There was no Protestant queen to protect playwrights, no golden age forged in defiance. The state was not hungry for stories of rebellion masked as history, and so his plays, though still brilliant, turned inward. He did not write of Richard III as a hunchback tyrant to justify the rise of Tudor legitimacy. He did not lionize Henry V as a boy king made godlike by war. There was no need to craft a narrative of heroic succession. The Tudors had never been questioned. Their rule had not been drenched in blood, nor purchased with broken vows. They had simply endured, and the stories of endurance do not beg for dramatization. They resist it. So he looked elsewhere. He turned to the ancient world, more often Rome, Greece, Carthage. He wrote of jealousy and revenge, of doomed lovers, of fathers broken by daughters, of storms and islands, and the strange workings of the human heart. But the fire beneath the language was gentler. There was no crackle of religious anxiety, no lingering scent of martyrdom. His words still soared, but they did not burn. The language itself shifted in subtle ways. There was no King James Bible, no project launched by a monarch desperate to unify a divided realm through rhythm and translation. There was no team of theologians crafting lines that would lodge in the English soul like scripture. The English that Shakespeare used was still rich, still strange, still beautiful, but it lacked that thunderous cadence, that sacred music. It was not born of battle, it was born of balance. His audiences were different, too. They did not gather to see their anxieties reflected in tragic kings or flawed queens. They came for reflection, not reassurance. They came to be moved, not warned. There was no danger of offense to the court, because the court was not perched on the edge of legitimacy. There was no queen whose head might roll if the people turned. There was no need for propaganda disguised as poetry. Only poetry. And so his fame came slowly. He was not hailed in his lifetime as the voice of a nation. The nation did not need a voice. It had a mass, a king, a lineage, an unbroken thread stretching back to a prince who had once lain on death's edge and come back. There were no revolutions to survive, no uprisings to tame, only the steady rhythm of seasons, of harvests, of peace. The printing press still carried his words, but fewer copies traveled abroad. England was not the exotic land of brave Protestant experiment. It was the quiet partner of Rome, of Spain, of the Catholic courts of Europe. English culture was rich, but not fashionable, respected, but not devoured. His plays were translated more slowly. They took longer to leave the island. In time, he became beloved, not as a symbol, but as a man, a playwright who saw people as they were, not as tools for politics, but as vessels for grief and wonder and the aching contradictions of love. He wrote not to define an age, but to hold a mirror to it, gently. And when he died in the year 1616, his passing was marked not with national mourning, nor with a burst of literary retrospection, but with quiet respect. He was buried beneath the stone of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. And for many years, his name was spoken in theaters and among scholars, but not yet carved into the bone of a nation. Because in this England, the soul of the people was still shaped by saints and sacraments, not sonnets. And yet, his words remained, softly, waiting, across the cold, slow waves of the Atlantic, beyond the edge of maps that still called wilderness by the names of myths. There was a land waking beneath ancient forests, where rivers curled like silver veins, and the sky stretched so wide, it seemed almost untouched by sin. It was the New World, still unnamed in full, still unclaimed in heart. And in the world shaped by King Arthur II, it would be touched, not by flames of faith torn from England's fractured soul, but by the quiet, careful hand of Catholic order, extended in peace beside the Spanish Armada's shadow. There was no Mayflower, no small wooden ship pushed out by wind and desperation. Its passengers cloaked in black, their prayers stiff with fear. Their eyes turned westward, because their homeland no longer welcomed their God. There were no Puritans in this England, because there had never been a need to purify. There was no Church of England to rebel against, no monarch splitting from Rome to chase a son, no compromise that pleased neither Protestant nor Catholic. England had never broken. It had knelt, quietly and confidently, before the old faith and remained there. The Puritans, in this timeline, had no cause to flee. They had no name at all. Dissent, when it appeared, was handled not with gallows or stake, but with redirection, with exile to monasteries, with lectures and sermons, with care from a church that remained vigilant and whole. Protestantism was not a wave, it was a whisper, and the whisper never reached the sea. So when ships left England's harbors in the later years of the 16th century, they did not carry the seeds of rebellion. They carried the banners of empire and sacrament, gold crosses and velvet-bound catechisms, maps inked in Spanish and Latin, marked with places already taken by allies, not enemies. They were not settlers seeking freedom. They were agents of expansion, measured, methodical, sanctified. The Spanish, still the giants of ocean conquest, welcomed their northern cousins to the venture with wary hands but open sails. England, once a rival and raider in another world, was now a trusted partner. A Catholic England meant Spanish galleons did not fear cannon fire from the Channel. It meant ports opened without bribes. It meant shared prayers before voyages and shared priests upon landfall. Together, they carved up the world not with swords alone, but with scripture. The Americas, so often imagined as a blank slate for English ambition, became instead a shared tapestry of Catholic intent. Churches rose before forts. Processions marched before plantations. The English settlers who arrived in this alternate Virginia knelt beside Jesuit priests and learned not the stern sermons of Geneva, but the ancient rhythms of Rome. Latin, not English, rang through the chapels built in the forests. The natives, still reeling beneath plague and steel, were baptized by friars, wearing crimson from Canterbury, not just Toledo. And the land did not welcome them easily, because the land itself was not waiting to be saved. It resisted, not just with arrows and fire, but with silence, with snow, with distance. It swallowed dreams with hunger. And in time, even the unity of Rome could not prevent the slow rot that settled into these colonies. The long, aching question of purpose. What does a people become when they leave their home not out of desperation, but duty? When their prayers are not for survival, but for obedience? These English colonists did not rebel, but neither did they dream. Their towns grew slowly, carefully. They built schools. They tilled earth. They raised sons who would never know the crackling myth of liberty, because liberty was not their inheritance. Obedience was. The church remained their spine. The crown remained their anchor. And across the centuries, as smoke rose from hearths built far from home, they looked not to revolution, but to preservation. There was no declaration, no constitution, no George Washington born of the gentry class elevated by monastery lands, because no monasteries had been dissolved, no new wealth created, no political appetite stirred. There was no Boston Tea Party, because there was no parliament to tax them without mercy. There was no revolution, because there was no rupture to avenge. The United States of America, the great experiment born of rebellion and rhetoric, never came into being. Instead, there were English colonies governed by Catholic governors, answering to a crown that had never cracked. They knelt at Mass. They celebrated saints' days. They married by bands and buried by bell. Their loyalties were inherited. Their questions, if whispered, remained that whispers. And so the idea of America, as it came to be known, the place of new beginnings, of fierce individualism, of enlightenment, ink spilled on parchment in candlelit taverns, was never born. It remained a dream deferred. Perhaps it stirred in the minds of a few. Perhaps a boy born in the woods dreamed of something more, something louder. But in this world, the soil of the new world bore the weight of the old die, and the old was unbroken. In the long hush of history, there are moments that scream and burn, and there are moments that whisper, slipping past like the hush of rain against old stone. Some moments make noise, they raise flags, shatter altars, crown queens who never marry, and kings who never kneel. Others change everything, simply by not happening. This story of Arthur II, the quiet king, the scholar who lived when he was meant to die, is one of those moments. And the world that grew from it was shaped not by rebellion, not by conquest, not by fire, but by the slow, steady rhythm of peace. It is easy to forget, in our own world of noise and speed, that peace can also leave scars. By the end of the 16th century, England stood not as a fiery beacon of Protestant independence, but as a loyal, well-lit chamber in the Cathedral of Rome. The Tudor dynasty, secured early by Arthur and Catherine's children and grandchildren, had grown long and stable. Its kings and queens were remembered more for diplomacy than declarations, more for marriages than manifestos. There had been no Reformation, no civil war, no glorious revolution. Parliament remained a servant, not a rival. The Church, untouched, still governed souls and crowned sovereigns. Cathedrals had never been gutted. Monasteries still sung. Bells still rang. And the streets of London, though bustling with trade and music, held no memory of bonfires lit for martyrs. It was, by all accounts, a peaceful age. And yet, beneath that peace, something was missing. There had been no burst of radical thought, no flood of literacy driven by vernacular Bibles or newly educated preachers. The printing press was tamed, not weaponized. The common people prayed, but they did not debate. They obeyed, but they did not question. The hierarchy remained intact, landed, lorded, and unquestioned. There had been no redistribution of monastic lands to create a powerful gentry class. No sudden rise of new families buying their way into Parliament. No fertile ground for democratic seeds to take root. The structure of medieval society had not been broken. It had simply been preserved. Like a flower pressed between two heavy pages, science came slowly, without the intellectual shockwaves of the Reformation. There had been no fierce questioning of authority, no Galileo challenging the heavens, no Newton discovering gravity with the urgency of a world newly shaken. Medicine advanced, but cautiously. Astronomy was still cloaked in religious approval, and philosophy tiptoed through the corridors of theology, careful not to knock over the statues. The world did not change because it had no need to, but change, when denied, does not vanish. It waits. And in this long, unbroken England, change became a ghost, hovering at the edges of poems, of paintings, of unsaid prayers, a longing without a name, a quiet sense that something vital had been missed. The rest of Europe marched onward. The 30 Years' War still happened. The Enlightenment still stirred in Paris. But England, the island that once would have defined itself by what it stood against, now drifted, defined instead by what it refused to disturb. The Americas were colonized by missionaries and governors, not rebels and dreamers. Shakespeare was remembered not as a national prophet, but as a playwright whose words pleased polite audiences and disturbed no monarchs. And the crown, still placed gently on the heads of Tudor heirs, still guided by Rome's invisible hand, continued into a 17th century that looked eerily like the one before it. Some called it a golden age, others, alul. But for those who wondered what might have been, the question always returned to a single chamber in a castle long ago. Ludlow, the year 1502, a boy too young to die, a fever that should have taken him, and didn't, a messenger who never left, a kingdom that never broke. Because had Arthur died, had that final breath not come, then everything might have been different. Henry, his brother, it would have risen to rule, hungry and restless, desperate to rewrite the world in his own image. The church would have cracked. The monasteries would have burned. Wives would have come and gone. Heads would have fallen. And daughters would have risen from the ashes to carve out a golden age in flame and steel. Elizabeth would have been born. America would have been born. The modern world, with all its brilliance and violence, all its freedom and fire, would have been born. Instead, Arthur lived. And because he lived, the world dreamed longer than it ever dared wake. So much of who we are was forged in the chaos his death created. So much of who we might have been was lost in the silence, his survival preserved. And now, centuries later, we walk through cities filled with noise, or speak languages shaped by protest, read scriptures born of rebellion, breathe freedoms born of revolt, and do not often remember the ghost who might have prevented it all. He does not haunt with chains or cries. He haunts with stillness. A king who lived too long, and in doing so, unlit the fire that shaped the world.